Welcome everybody to today's Mideast breakfast seminar. I'm very pleased to have Ahmet Kuru with us, who this year has published the book Islam, Authoritarianism and Underdevelopment. There could have been one more element in that title, namely violence. The book is also a lot about organized violence. It's a long comparative historical take, something that's to the liking of, I believe, many of us in the room, and we're looking very much forward to Ahmet Kuru's presentation. This is a breakfast seminar in a series of Mideast breakfast seminars hosted by PRIO's new Middle East Center, which I lead. The Mideast Center is set up with funding from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a grant administered by the Research Council of Norway. It's a 4-year grant, a grant mechanism very much to our liking here at PRIO, because it allows us to focus on a particular set of issues, but nonetheless with considerable flexibility so that we can adapt both to changing realities in the region and to opportunities that emerge for collaboration and new initiatives. I'm very pleased to see so many of you in the room this morning. We hope you enjoyed the breakfast. There is coffee over there. It is allowed to stand up while we proceed and top up on coffee or have some more breakfast. But now, with no further ado, I'll simply introduce Ahmet, who will give a brief presentation of his book. Not so brief, but after all, the format is quite compact. We want to cater to busy people who can have breakfast here on their way to work, get some intellectual food for thought, and at the same time also cater to their other obligations. So that's the background for the experiment with the compact format. So far, I have to say it's worked very well. We hope it will work well today too. It's a real pleasure to have you here, Ahmet. The floor is yours.
Thanks for Christian and PRIO for inviting me, and thanks for coming before the sunrise. So I'm very happy to be here. It was really boring in San Diego, always wearing t-shirt, and finally I taste some seasonal change. So the question is contemporary. Why do Muslim majority countries exhibit low levels of development and high levels of authoritarianism in comparison to not only Western countries, but also world averages? When I say Muslim world, I refer to 49 Muslim majority countries. And then when we look at the Freedom House data and its list of electoral democracies, in the Muslim world, 60% of all countries, 14% of countries are electoral democracies, whereas in the world, in average, 60% of them are democratic. What explains this gap? And when we look at the economic criteria and socioeconomic criteria, the GNI per capita in Muslim majority countries, despite the fact that they have 60% of world's oil reserves, and many of them are oil-rich countries, the average GNI per capita only $9,000, whereas the world average is $14,000. And also literacy rates, schooling, and life expectancy show a gap between the average scores of Muslim majority countries and the average score of the world. So what explains the gap? There are 3 main arguments in the literature. One is the essentialist argument, mostly popularized by Bernard Lewis and Samuel Huntington, singling out Islam and Islam as the main problem. Then the second is the anti-colonialist argument, referring to Western imperialism and colonization as the source of problems. And the third and more recent argument, new institutionalism. Daran Acemoğlu and others emphasize that extractive institutions are source of underdevelopment and inclusive institutions are good for development. So in the book, I discuss all 3, give them some credit, but also show weaknesses and provide an alternative. What is the alternative? So it may be better for me to change location. There's no camera, right? I can move around. So, and also remove the jacket. to have more informal discussion here. So basically, many books analyzing the problems focus on the problematic contemporary era, forgetting Muslims' early success. And when we look at the Muslims' early success, we understand that it's not about Islam, because Islam was perfectly compatible with progress for 5 centuries, from 7 to 12 centuries. And then when we look at the stagnation intellectually, economically began before colonization. Therefore, I say it cannot simply be reduced as a problem of being colonized. And then institutions are important, but who made the institutions? Institutions are not self-creating. Some human agencies, some classes create them. So my argument is that when we look at Muslim world in comparison to the Western Europe, there are 3 major episodes. In the first period, I call this Muslim supremacy. Why? Because at that time, Muslims had cutting-edge philosophers, scientists, from the Baghdad scholars to the death of Ibn Rushd. For about 400 years, they were better than Western Europeans. When Muslim libraries had hundreds of thousands of copies, Western European libraries have few books, few hundreds. Then economically, Western Europe did not have a coin, gold or silver, using the Abbasi dinar imitation or the Byzantine imitations until 1252. And for a long time, Muslims had an economic superiority, and also militarily, they had military might. Then, so this is an important point in the book, that it didn't lead to Western supremacy immediately. The Western supremacy was not something overnight. There was a moment of episode of 400 years when Muslim and European level of development, scientifically, intellectually, economically, were comparable. Then came the rise of the West, reach today. So what explained the shift from very successful Muslim world to level of comparable levels than the Western success? I argue that neither Western Europe nor the Muslim world is unique. They can be explained by the same variable, which is class relations. I look at the relations between 4 classes of actors: intellectuals, economic entrepreneurs, clergy, and the ruling class. In the Muslim world, during the so-called Golden Era, the scholars were funded mostly by merchants and commerce. And the merchants had very large level of autonomy, and they were doing intercontinental trade. But mid-11th century, around 1050, was a critical juncture, which led a path-dependent legacy of institutional, intellectual, economic stagnation. Because of the class relations change, because the clergy and the ruling class, I call the ulama and the military state, came together, made an established alliance, and they undermine scholars and merchants. That's the reason of stagnation. Whereas in Europe, Western Europe, we saw the opposite. For a long time, from the 7th to 12th centuries, Catholic Church and the military aristocracy dominated Europe. After the 11th century, then came the rise of merchant class with certain level of bourgeoisie and city-states in Italy and elsewhere. Came universities after the 11th century, Cambridge, Oxford, and others. And then the rise of bourgeoisie and intellectuals led to the rise of the West and Western Europe, similar to the Muslim Golden Era. That was the class dynamics. So during the Golden Era, Muslim independent scholars include not only secular philosophers like Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, and others, but also Islamic scholars. Ulama at that time had certain level of autonomy, and they were very adamant to put a distance between themselves and the political authority. It was a legacy of the Umayyads who persecuted the Prophet family. Not only Shia, but also Sunnis were disenchanted by the political authority. And for 4 or 5 centuries, they tried to put a distance between themselves and ruling class. So in addition to philosophers and polymaths like Harazmi, Razi, Ibn Haytham, Farabi, Ibn Sina, Biruni, who made important contribution to mathematics, trigonometry, algorithms, and then optics. Al-Haytham developed the first camera obscurica, which is the origin of camera today. There were also ulama like Abu Hanifa, and then we have even quantifiable data. A scholar analyzed recently 3,900 Islamic scholars from 8th to mid-11th centuries, and only 9% of them receive salary from the state. 91% were privately funded, mostly by commerce. And Abu Hanifa, as an important scholar, because he is the founder of the Hanafi Mazhab, and he was a silk merchant, and the Abbasi Caliph of the time invited him to be the Qadi, the judge. Abu Hanifa refused. He didn't want to be involved with a despotic regime. Then this Caliph insisted and then asked, give me a reason why you refuse my offer. Then he said, I'm not qualified. That's what I refuse. Then the Caliph said, you are a liar. Then Abu Hanifa said, how can a liar be judge? That's the pause. And then Abu Khalif put him in prison. There were certain level of torture, and then he was poisoned to death. But it was not an exception. Ahmet ibn Hanbal also stood up against the government, and this collective consciousness of the ulama was very important to establish certain separation between Islamic authorities and state authorities. But after the 11th century, things change. How and why? Because in the 10th and 11th centuries, Muslim world were mostly dominated by Shia powers, except the Andalus in the west and then Central Asia in the east. All territories were dominated by Fatimis, Hamdanis, Karmatis, Buyids, Shia dynasties. And the Abbasi caliphs in Baghdad were not happy. 2 caliphs, father and son, ruled for about 50 years, Qadir and Qaim, and they wanted to change this geopolitics. They declare a Sunni creed, and it was a call for all Sunnis to come together on religious terms and change this geopolitics in the Muslim world. And the creed includes the argument that those who argue that the Quran is created, the Mu'tazila, rationalist theologians, are infidel, apostate. Those certain Shias, Ismaili Shias especially, are apostates. They shall be killed. And the call was well received by Turks in Central Asia. First Mahmud of Ghaznavids, then the Seljuks. They came to Baghdad, allied with the Abbasi caliphs. And then the third component was Persian bureaucrats, especially Nizam al-Mulk, the prime minister of the Seljuk Empire. And this political/religious combination meant the rise of Sunni orthodoxy, and they also had an economic component. Because at that time, the economy had a crisis. The agriculture production in Iraq was declining, and the treasury was almost empty. Therefore, starting with the late Abbasi, during the Buwayhids, and especially in the Seljuks, the state started to pay the salaries of the officials by distributing land and tax farming. That shrunk and limited private property of land ownership. And that's Iqta system in the Seljuks, then Timar system, and with other names, it continued in the Ottomans and other empires. So when you combine the Qadiri creed of Sunni orthodoxy, the Iqta system of state central economy, then the military state with the Seljuks, Ghaznavis, and other Turks emphasizing conquest, and that means the agents, Abbasi caliphs, Seljuk sultans, Nizam al-Mulk, came together. Nizam al-Mulk established madrasas called the Nizamiya madrasas, which exclude philosophy and focus on more religious sciences. And Nizamiya madrasas gave birth to a genius, Ghazali. And Ghazali played a very important role with certain influential books. He attacked philosophy, he attacked Ismaili Shias, and then he justified certain level of ulema-state alliance. The result is the marginalization of scholars, marginalization of merchants, and the stagnation started in the Muslim world. So, some scholars argue that the stagnation in the Muslim world was mostly done by the foreign invaders, Mongols and Crusaders. I give partial credit to this because the foreigners did not simply destroy the brilliant civilization, but they helped the ulema-state alliance in a way that when people faced the massacres, millions of people were murdered in Central Asia by Mongols, then the people turned to military heroes, because if you have a survival threat, you can't look for artists, good paintings, etc. Your first priority became your survival. And the military hero came, Saladin. And Saladin defeated the Crusaders, reconquered Jerusalem, but he also destroyed the Shia regime in Syria and Egypt and brought the Seljuk model of ulema-state alliance to Syria and Egypt. And let me give you another anecdote. There has been the discussion whether Muslims destroyed the library in Alexandria. So the story is that when Amr ibn al-As came and conquered Alexandria, he found out a major antique library. He called Omar what to do. No, there was no phone at that time, of course. So what to do? Then Omar said, if the books are compatible with the Quran, we don't need them, just burn them. If the books are contradictory to Quran, it's even worse, burn them. So they destroyed the library. So we today know that it's fabricated. 300s before Muslims arrived, the library was already abolished for various reasons. It's non-existent when Muslims came. But who produced this story? Was that some Islamophobes? No, a Muslim historian produced the story, an Arab historian. Why did he produce the story? Because he fabricated the story to justify that Saladin, when he came to Egypt, destroyed the Fatimi library. And then the historian was a son of a close friend of Saladin. And in order to justify, he said, oh, that's what we do. When we came first Egypt, we destroyed Alexandria library. It was perfectly fine for Saladin to destroy. Why did Saladin destroy? Because Saladin regarded the Fatimi library as a combination of heretic books. Maybe he needed money. He sold certain books. But various reasons, Saladin established the Ayyubi dynasty. Ayyubi dynasty turned to Mamluks in Egypt and Syria, and it would represent ulema-state alliance. And it wasn't really representing the early Muslim philosophical achievement. That's a different understanding of Islam, different understanding of ulema-state relations. So, and we have now in Egypt and Syria an important scholar who justify ulema-state alliance. In the Quran, there is no statement about the state. There is only one phrase saying, ulil amr minkum, those who have authority among you, so follow them, respect them. But who is ulil amr? Who has the authority? For centuries, this vague verse in the Quran, the phrase understood as those who have expertise, those who have knowledge, wisdom, etc. But later on, it started to be understood, especially after the 11th century, those who have political power. And Ibn Taymiyyah, in his important book on Sharia-based government, Siyasat al-Sharia, he said that the verse referred to ulama and umara. Umara means amirs, plural, it is the rulers, and the ulama. So they find even a justification for the ulama-state alliance in the Quran. So what is the result? The result is that Muslim world still produce cutting-edge scholars between 12th and 14th century. Intellectual decline was not something overnight. Ibn Rushd, major philosopher, Ibn Khaldun regarded as the first social scientist, but they were neglected at best, eliminated and demonized at worst. Ibn Rushd, many of his books were burned. Ibn Khaldun was forgotten for centuries. And then an important network of merchants, the Kerime merchants in Egypt, who were doing intercontinental trade for centuries. They were marginalized by Mamluk military authority. And that's how the Ulema-State alliance shift from Eastern territories to Eastern Mediterranean. That's how the Crusaders and Mongols helped the Ulema-State alliance. So we have data in Schatzmiller's book, a Canadian historian, and she combined the number of terms in commercial books in the so-called Golden Era and the later centuries, especially in Egypt, but also in Baghdad and elsewhere. When we look at the terminology, the number of terms, the terms about commerce almost the same with slight decline, but the terms about the state bureaucracy and the military and the ulama increase from about 100 to about 500. It shows how they had financial capacity to have division of labor, more working and recruiting people. For example, for the terminology like bank manager, vice bank manager, they almost stay stagnant, whereas the number of terms about Ulema-State alliance became 5 times more because of their resources, their importance, and their division of labor. That's the comparison between Golden Era and later centuries. So this Ulema-State alliance after Mamluks was spread to all around the Muslim world by 3 empires, the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals. And these empires ruled at the time of the rise of the West. And in the book, I analyzed the rise of the West, and certain scholars emphasize that the Western Europeans used 3 instruments very effectively: gunpowder, printing press, and nautical compass. But out of the 3, Muslims only pick and use effectively the first one, gunpowder. That's why Marshall Hodgson, the Islamic historian, called the 3 as gunpowder empires. But printing press, Muslims didn't embrace the technology for 3 centuries. Even after 3 centuries, it still took time because the ulama put many barriers in printing books. Why and how? Out of the 3, they pick only gunpowder. Because in the negotiating table of these empires, there were army generals, and the commanders regarded the importance of the gunpowder, took the technology, it perfectly served their interests. But for the military generals, commanders, either printing press or the nautical compass were not that important. Only the Ottomans had a navy, but the Ottomans did not have a commercial fleet. They mostly focused on a military aspect of navigation. And the ulama was the class which was supposed to understand the importance of printing press, but the ulama mostly regarded it as a threat to their monopoly. Therefore, for example, in the Ottoman case, the ulama first didn't allow the printing press. After they issue a fatwa only for non-religious books, linguistics, grammar, geography, history. Then after they say religious books are okay, but not the Quran. Then they said the Quran was permissible to print, but only in Arabic original. Then it took 2 more centuries for Turks to print a translation of the Quran. It was 1924 after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. During the empire itself, a translation of Turkish translation or Persian translation of the Quran was never printed. So why is it important? Because when the Europeans use these 3 very effectively, when Muslims had a very much belated usage of printing press, the literacy rates appear to be in the early 1800s, only 1% average estimate, these are estimate numbers, in the Ottoman Empire, whereas 31% in Western Europe. And in the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was the only Muslim land where there were working printing presses. And the number of books estimate is 50,000. In the same century, 18th century, the number of printed in Western Europe was 1 billion. So 50,000 versus 1 billion. 20,000 times more books published in Western Europe. So therefore, remember the very beginning of the presentation that there's a literacy gap between the Muslim world and the Western world, Muslim world, even with the world average. And there is a path-dependent historical explanation of why we have the literacy gap today. So then came colonization. As I argue, colonization came after the stagnation already occurred in the Muslim world, and it further contributed to problems. And then the last question I want to understand before conclude is that from Atatürk of Turkey, from the Kemal of Turkey to Cemal of Egypt, many secularist leaders attacked the ulama and madrasa. Why couldn't they solve the problem? Why don't we see any progress? One major reason is that these modernist top-down projects were mostly led by military generals. And the military generals, again, based on their class notion, were anti-intellectual and they were very statist. And also they established modern versions of ulama-state alliance. The Kemalist Republic in Turkey established the Diyanet. And from that time to now Erdogan's Turkey, Turkey has 100,000 mosques. In each of them, the imams recite the sermon on Fridays based on a standard text provided them from the central government authority, Ankara. So the imams don't have the freedom to give a sermon based on their understanding, and it's a highly centralized system represent the Ottoman Ulema State Alliance, even in modern so-called secular Turkish Republic. And in Egypt, Nasser made Al-Azhar and the Sheikh of Al-Azhar as a political appointee and turned it into a politicized institution. So after the Iranian Revolution, Islamization came as a challenge to modernist failures, but the Islamist actors brought a very medieval notion of ulama-state alliance. Therefore, they couldn't solve problems, they reproduced problems. So to conclude, Islam is not the cause, and even if those who argue that Islam caused problems because it rejects religion-state separation, they don't know the early Islamic history, where there are many examples of certain separation. Colonialism is not the primary cause of the Muslim decline because chronologically it came after. And authoritarian effective institutions are important, but they are created by ulama-state alliance, which have both an ideology and power we should not underestimate. And my policy recommendation for the Muslim world is that Muslims, rather than seeking help and guidance from the clergy and the state authorities, they really need to appreciate, support, and attach importance to intellectuals and economic entrepreneurs. Thanks for listening. I'll be happy to answer if there are questions.